King Harsha of Kannauj, he possessed many war boats that accompanied him on his expeditions. And his inscriptions always referred to ships, elephants, and horses. At one of their heritage national festivals, which was held in 2013, they showed a sculpture of Vishnu, which is supposed to have been dated to about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. The Japanese have their 6 schools or 6 doctrines of philosophy, which basically is taken from the Indian, the 6 darshanas or the schools of philosophy which we have in our Hindu scriptures. Good morning, viewers. Today I'll be giving a talk on the spread of Hinduism in East and Southeast Asia. As you are aware, in the ancient times, India had a large presence in these regions, which in the present context now generally goes unnoticed. So I'll start firstly, I'll give a brief introduction to my talk. Since around the year 500 BC, because of the socio-economic and cultural diffusion of Hinduism in Southeast Asia, our culture and traditions went and took hold over the existing indigenous belief systems. The spread of Hinduism in these regions was generally peaceful through absorption, but there were instances where the kings had to use force and conquest to gain territory in the area. The local adoption of the more advanced Indian culture in these regions was called indigenization. These Indianized kings, this was a term coined by a famous French epigraphist, Georges Codiz, were characterized by resilience, political integrity, and administrative ability. All these regions came under the influence, becoming part of Greater India, that is Akhand Bharat. By the early centuries of the Common Era, most of the kingdoms had absorbed aspects of Hindu religion, culture, and administration. One of the main features of this absorption was the cult of divine godship, a model which was adopted through the Indian concept of Devraj, which we'll go into in detail subsequently. Sanskrit language and other epigraphic systems were made official in all these countries. The religious texts and beliefs also traveled to China and Japan, though that was mainly overland routes. The other places were mostly seaborne. Now, Hinduism in Southeast Asia had a profound impact on the development of religious philosophy, culture, and the region's history. The more advanced Indic scripts were introduced, and people of Southeast Asia produced their earliest inscriptions around the 1st to the 5th centuries CE. By the start of the Common Era, Hinduism had covered the area from Madagascar to Philippines, the oceans in between aptly being called the Indian Ocean, the only ocean in the world named after a country. Hindu merchants dominated trade, Hindu kings ruled over vast territories, and Hindu civilization was predominant culture in the Indian Ocean littoral, Southeast Asia, Philippines, and it even made inroads into Japan and China, as I mentioned earlier. Though the Indianized kingdoms, small indigenous polities transformed into major kingdoms. So earlier there were small states there, but with our Indian statecraft and philosophy permeating in these regions, they all expanded to become large empires and kingdoms, and they ruled for centuries based on those systems and beliefs. Now, there is a pervasive myth that Indian and Hindu influences came to Southeast Asia only by peaceful means, and India never invaded any country. But this is incorrect to an extent, as many countries were taken over by conquest by Indian kings in the ancient times. Now, this myth basically is it compares the invasions by Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and other later the Europeans over India. So this is actually incorrect, and why I am saying it's incorrect is because the colonial historians wanted to depict Indians as meek and non-aggressive, and this suited the agenda of keeping the Indian masses under control during the period of their rule, and thus this narrative was spread. There is also an implicit suggestion that war in medieval world was fought for the same reasons, that is for basically expansion and conquest. However, the Indian invasions which took place generally were rarely for annexation. They were more for extracting tribute and for symbolism. We are aware of the terms of Digvijay and Chakravarti Rajas, so it was more to symbolic means the person had power over the region, but rarely did Indian conquest annex permanently any region. I'll be the sequence of presentation. I'll just mention how I'll go about this talk. It's a little longish talk because it's a vast region, as you are aware. So basically, I'll be touching on the factors which contributed to the spread of Hinduism. I'll touch on the ancient Indian maritime history, because that is a topic which is not much known in the present terms, how big a maritime power India was in ancient times. Then I'll touch on the Southeast Asian linkages, how these linkages developed over time. Then I'll also explain about few of the Indian kingdoms of the ancient times which had a major impact over Southeast Asia region. And finally, I will be touching country-wise on how Hinduism entered each country and dynasty in the Southeast Asian regions. This will be divided into 12 ancient dynasties, countries of the past. Now, coming to the factors contributing to the spread of Hinduism. Arthashastra, we have all heard of, written by Chanakya in the 3rd century BC. It basically lays down two prime duties of any king in his manual. The first is to protect the state from external aggression, and the second is expansion of its territory by conquest. Only then can a dynasty or an empire be self-sustaining. You cannot remain focused within a geographical area permanently and expect to sustain itself. So it has to expand if it needs to sustain itself in the long term. And thus, the spread of Hinduism in Southeast Asia was achieved through a combination of basically two factors. The first factor, as I mentioned, was conquests. Now, Rajaraja Chola I of the Chola dynasty and his successors, starting from about 1025 CE, they invaded various countries in this region like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pegu in Burma, and southern Thailand. So the first way our culture spread was through conquest, and the second region was basically economic. The entrepreneurial spirit of our traders, and coupled with a lot of Kshatriyas and princes migrated to these regions in the past times due to various reasons which we will touch on later, and their bringing superior culture and developed religious beliefs and advanced scientific knowledge helped them to establish themselves in these regions and make big empires. Now, coming to the ancient Indian maritime history. Ancient Indian maritime history was one of the prime reasons why of our spreading our culture over this vast eastern and southeastern regions. Because without being a big maritime power, this could have never taken place, only through overland routes, because of, we are aware, the Himalayas and the other geographical reasons why it was not very easy to travel overland. So, and especially in Southeast Asia, there are mostly islands or remote places which could only be accessed by the sea. Now, our subcontinent's geographical location at the center of the Indian Ocean, it provides us a very commanding position in the region due to its geographical region. And coupled with this, India is also blessed with a large network of navigable rivers, and the climate is very warm and suitable, not extreme climates. So these all factors actually helped in our culture to expand very easily. In addition to this, India is blessed with a large number of forested areas, and this was a good source of timber for constructing those ships and boats, which is also important in the long term if we had to be a maritime power, especially in the ancient times. Then we should not forget that the monsoons also played an important part in our developing a maritime power, because the monsoon winds are very steady and the period of the monsoon winds is quite fixed. So it provided a very good means by which the ships could sail across the Bay of Bengal in both the directions, depending on the monsoons coming towards the Indian subcontinent or going southeast. Now, maritime activities have been mentioned as early as in the Rig Veda, and also mentioned in the Buddhist Jhatkas, the Greek and Roman historians, and even early Tamil poems. So, from very ancient prehistoric times, more or less, India has always enjoyed a good presence at sea, and these references which I mentioned are proof of that. Our maritime history actually goes back over 5,000 years, and we are aware that the world's first tidal docks was made at Lothal in the year as early as 2300 BC in the Saraswati Harappan civilization on the Gujarat coast. Now, there are also references in the Rig Veda to the side wings of a ship known as plava. So those outriggers which provide stability to a boat in stormy and rough seas. One even sees them today in various coastal areas. So these are even mentioned as early as in the Rig Veda. And the Rig Veda interestingly also mentions a ship as large as having 100 oars. So one can imagine how large size ships were plying even in those ancient times. To give an indication, a 100-oar boat, if you calculate in terms of its length and width, would be roughly about 400 feet long. So a ship as large as that were being used even in those ancient times. Now, Indians from the Bay of Khambat, that is on our western coast, had established trade links with Yemen as early as 1200 BCE. And this is proven by the fact of discovering black pepper from within the pyramids in Egypt. So it shows that our trade links with the Western world were as old as that. And it has been also found that a recent DNA study of Australian Aborigines has found that about 11% of their DNA is of ancient ancestry, and it probably came to Australia about 4,000 years ago. So that is how ancient the Indians probably migrated to those regions. Now, Megasthenes, who was there from 350 to 290 BC, the ancient Greek explorer, in his book Indica, mentions the existence of a shipbuilding industry under Chandragupta Maurya, who ruled from 322 to 298 BC. The Mauryan Empire maintained cordial relations with the Hellenistic powers through trade, and a large part of which was carried out from the present-day Gujarat and Kutch coasts. The Mauryan navy under Ashoka, who ruled from 273 to 232 BC, he sent diplomatic missions by sea to as remote areas as Greece, Syria, Egypt, Cyrene, Macedonia, and Epirus. Another interesting fact is that off the Tamil Nadu coast, pearl diving and sea fishery were important sources of livelihood, of which documented records are available. And during the reign of King Solomon in the Middle East, which is around 1000 BC, it is found written in their records that, I quote, once in every 3 years, the ships of Tarish came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So that shows, again, provides evidence to the fact of our ancient trade links from ancient times through the maritime route. Normally, when we talk about battles waged between Indian kingdoms in the ancient times or even in the recent past, we normally assume that they were land-based, using probably horses, elephants, and such. But in reality, many of these smaller kingdoms also possessed ships and boats, and these were extensively used during battles. Now, in the 7th century CE, King Harsha of Kannauj, he possessed many war boats that accompanied him on his expeditions, and his inscriptions always referred to ships, elephants, and horses. So it is a established fact that he did use war boats during his battles. In the same era, Chalukya princes also maintained a considerable naval force, and there are the Nilgunda plates of Vikramaditya VI states that there was a king by the name of Mangalisa of the Western Chalukya dynasty who fitted out a grand fleet and captured the island of Revati, which is roughly in the area of Konkan in present-day western coast of India. So there are enough of references to show that ships and boats were extensively used in the past, not only for trade but even for waging battles. Now, Arthashastra, as I mentioned earlier, again gives a detailed description of maritime activities and how to organization for it and how to go about. And during the reign of Chandragupta Maurya, when this book was written, that was the first time when actually an attempt was made to raise a grand navy which was substantial in size. Kautilya also mentions a post of a superintendent of ships in his book when giving the organization, named as Navadhyakshya. He was an officer who looked after the ports, shipping and security of maritime traders. So this is also listed, and he classified ships into 4 categories, basically commercial, private, royal ships and warships. So all this categorization is given in the Arthashastra. And the commercial ships were again further subdivided into merchant ships and passenger ships. So such details about shipping and maritime activities had been specified, meaning that time there was a proper organization and of the maritime fleets in India. Now I'll touch upon 2 dynasties which had famous maritime activities in their tenure. The first is the Gupta Empire. Gupta Empire was one of the largest empires in ancient India, and in their documentation they always specified their military, classifying it, subdividing it into 5 arms, which were the infantry, cavalry, chariots, elephants and ships. So ships were very much a part of their military. And there is a copper plate, Gunyaghar copper plate inscription of Vanya Gupta, who was in the reign, which is dated to about 507 CE. It mentions ships and doesn't even mention chariots. So the importance of ships was even more than chariots, which is can be seen from this inscription. Now we are aware that there was this maritime Silk Route which flourished between the 2nd century BC and 15th century CE, which connected China, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Arabian Peninsula, Somalia, Egypt and Europe. Now everyone associates the maritime Silk Route with China, but actually this is incorrect, because it was primarily established and operated by Austronesian sailors in the Southeast Asia, by Tamil merchants in the Indian and Southeast Asia region, by the Greco-Roman merchants in East Africa, India, Ceylon, and by the Arab traders in the Arabian Sea. And for most of the history during which time the maritime Silk Route functioned, the Hindu kingdoms of Southeast Asia controlled this route, and especially the polities around the Straits of Malacca and Banka, the Malaya Peninsula and the Mekong Delta. Now the other dynasty which had major maritime presence in our region was the Cholas, which most of us are aware of. The Chola Navy was the zenith of ancient Indian sea power and played a vital role in the expansion of the empire. And Chola admirals commanded great respect, and they acted as diplomats of the empire wherever they went. From about 900 to 1100 CE, the Chola Navy grew from a small backwater entity to a potent power projection and diplomatic symbol, and excelled in trade and maritime activity, extending their influence even up to China and over the whole of Southeast Asia. The greatest naval expeditions of the Chola took place basically under 2 of their greatest emperors, kings. One was Raj Raja Chola, who ruled from 985 to 1014 CE. And the second was during the period of Rajendra Chola, who ruled from 1014 to 1044 CE. And it was during Rajendra Chola's time that the territory was expanded across South Asia, and he was one of the few emperors to actually acquire territory beyond the Indian subcontinent. The Chola navy thereafter started declining from about 13th century CE, when they started having battles, internal battles with the Chalukyas. So that was after which the decline of the navy started. Now I'll go across to the India-Southeast Asia linkages. As early as in the Ramayana, Southeast Asia has been mentioned. There was that incident after Sita Mata was abducted by Ravan. So Sugriv, who was the chief of Ram's army, sent military detachments in all the 4 directions to search for her, which one is aware of after having read Ramayana. And the one which, the detachment which was sent to the east, it mentions that they were sent to Yavadvipa, and Yavadvipa actually is the island of Java. So one finds mention of Southeast Asian islands even in the Ramayana. There was a Hindu Tarumagara kingdom which was established in West Java around 400 BC. So as early as 400 BC, one of the first Hindu kingdoms was established in Southeast Asia, and they produced among the earliest inscriptions in Indonesian history. And these Taruma kings were worshippers of Vishnu. The Indian connection increased during the time of the Cholas, as I mentioned earlier, and it was only around 425 CE when Buddhist influence started appearing in this Southeast Asian region. So the Indian influence in Southeast Asia was at its zenith between 290 BCE and about the 15th century CE. So this would be inclusive of the Hindu as well as the Buddhist period, covers both the periods. The kingdoms of India's northeast maintained trade relations with Southeast Asian countries such as Burma, Thailand, Indonesia and Cambodia. And this Sanskritization or Indianization of this region took place during this period, and it influenced the language, literature, culture, calendar, traditions and belief systems of the indigenous people. The kingdoms, as I mentioned, were initially all Hindu kingdoms, and later in most of these regions the Mahayana Buddhists influence came through, and in most of the cases, even after the Buddhist influences came, the religion followed was an amalgamation actually of the two, about which I'll again talk later. So it was not that Hinduism vanished, but they amalgamated sort of and continued both. The most common form of Hinduism in this region was Shaivism, and after that came Vaishnavism. And it is interesting to know that the name of Burma, of the country, is supposed to be derived from the name Brahma. So it was that influence was so much in the ancient times. The Khmer kings of Cambodia, they actually worshipped Harihara, who is an amalgamation of Vishnu and Shiva, and their statues have been even found in Badami caves in North Karnataka, signifying the close ties which the Khmers had with South Indian South Indians. And one should remember that before Hinduism appeared in the region, the locals did have a indigenous, their own indigenous civilization. However, it was not much advanced. The French scholar Georges Codes, he describes the evolution of the indigenous cultures, and he mentions that the Hindu influences brought a highly developed and sophisticated religion, literature, art, architectural style, Sanskrit language, systems of philosophy, and the institution of kingship, and stories from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Purans. And observance of injunctions of the Dharma Shastras, the ancient text on the law and conduct which we have in Hinduism, and in particular the Manusmriti also was very much common in the ancient Hindu kingdoms and followed quite strictly. Now, it took about 200 to 300 years, during which time the entire Indochina, Burma, Siam, Malaya Peninsula, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Celebes, and Bali, right up to the Philippines, came under varying degrees of Hindu influence. Initially, most of this was through the trade routes by the Indian traders who spread across this region, and there the reason for that was the abundance of gold and spices in this area, which attracted these traders. And then, as knowledge of the monsoon winds and the monsoon's direction spread over time, mainly after the 1st century CE, the sea routes became not only more dependable and regulated, but improved means of transport helped grow this trade activity, Indian trade activity in this region. And elaborate trade routes were established. A bit about part of the linkages which we have between India and Southeast Asia are the art and architecture. So, one should remember that the Hindu influence throughout Southeast Asia basically owes much of its legacy to the Chola dynasty. They were the sole reason, their impact was the biggest in this region. In terms of architecture, sculpture, art forms, Hindu influence, and this led to the building of some of the finest Shiva and Vishnu temples in the region being built. Up till nearly the 12th century CE, nearly all the temples built in the region were Hindu temples. Subsequently, Buddhist influence made inroads, and many temples became actually both Hindu, a combination of Hindu and Buddhist temples. Since the origin and the philosophy was quite similar, they coexisted quite comfortably, as was even the happened in India itself. One should remember that many of the names which we read about these kingdoms of Southeast Asia have Chinese connotations. The reason for that is most of the recordings which were done by travelers in the ancient times, which we refer to even today, were by Chinese travelers, and hence they gave their own names to these kingdoms. So, they may be known, the words may have Chinese connotation, but they were actually the Hindu kingdoms and not the Chinese ones which came up. There is a slight misconception in this regard to most people. And we all are aware that two of the biggest temples in the world exist in this region. The earliest one was now known as the Pramban temple in Indonesia, which was made in the 9th century. It is the second largest temple in the region, and the largest in the region and in the world itself, we all know, is Angkor Wat, which was made in the 12th century BC. So this is how strong the Indian influence was in that region in those times. Now I'll touch upon, as I had mentioned in the initial part, the major Indian empires which impacted Southeast Asia. So there are basically two empires which had a major impact. The first was the Kalinga Empire, the first and the earliest was the Kalinga, and the second were, as I mentioned, the Cholas. Now the Kalinga kingdom is basically the kingdom which is donated between the rivers of Mahanadi and Godavari. That was the general extent of the Kalinga kingdom in ancient times. It was a very powerful kingdom, and mention of it can be found even in Mahabharata, because the king of Kalinga at that time, whose name was Sutrayuddha, he joined the Kauravas in the Mahabharata war, and it is that old, the Kalinga kingdom. Now the Kalinga dynasty lasted roughly between 1100 to 261 BCE. Thereafter, Ashoka merged the Kalinga kingdom into the Magad Empire after he defeated the Kalinga kings. Now, which happened in 216 BCE. Now the Kalingan influence in Southeast Asia, there are a few highlights of that. The first was that there was a merchant by the name of Kaundinya I. He actually became the co-founder of the major Funan kingdom, which is centered in modern Cambodia. After he went there, he was a merchant who went there and married the local Naga princess with the name of Soma. And he belonged to Kalinga. In the 8th century, the major Shailendra dynasty of Java, they also are supposed to have originated from Kalinga. This dynasty was a powerful dynasty in Cambodia and in the Champa region. And Burma itself locally was known as Kalinga Rath, and there is evidence of early merchant settlements and Buddhist missions in the Mon regions. And by 2nd century CE, Kalinga migrants had presence in various parts of Burma. So Kalinga actually played a major role in the initial phases of the spread of Hindu influence over this region. Now, it's not only in Southeast Asia. The first Maldivian kingdom of Dhiva Mari, the dynasty known as Dhiva Mari, was established around 3rd century BCE. And the person who established, by the name of Surya Arjuna Aditya, he belonged to the Solar dynasty, and he was actually an exiled prince of the king of the Kalinga kingdom by the name of Brahmaditya. And he laid the foundation of the Aditya dynasty in Maldives. So even the Maldives sort of came under the Kalingan influence. And then as far as the Philippines, the king of one of the islands is known as Butuan in Philippines. The title of the king is Kiling, K-I-L-I-N-G, and it is naturally derived from the word Kalinga. So the influence of Kalinga even was there till the Philippines. Incidentally, Kiling is still used in Southeast Asia to refer to a person of Indian origin. Now the maritime power. The Kalingan kingdom also was a big maritime power, and their maritime history starts from about 800 BCE, as old as that. and they sailed initially along the Indian coast and then traveled to Indochina and throughout the maritime regions of Southeast Asia. Three factors contributed to Kalinga's maritime outreach. The first was they had a very good network of navigable rivers in the interiors of the Kalinga kingdom, where precious and semi-precious stones were found. And the deltas of these rivers were found provided very ideal natural harbors from where external trade then took place. So the internal navigation was well connected to the external export from where ships then carried these forward to the Southeast Asian region. The second factor contributing to Kalinga's outreach was the seasonal monsoons. As I mentioned earlier, very predictable monsoon winds and the directions. Both from June to September, the winds blew towards Kalinga, and then from October onwards, they blew towards Southeast Asia. So they provided a very structured sort of timetable for ships to sail in either direction. And the third factor, major factor, is the shipbuilding expertise. The Kalingans were excellent shipbuilders, and there are a number of ancient texts which mention the which describe the description of the shipbuilding in those times, and they have even found shipbuilding tools like adges and other artifacts from Chilka Lake in the recent past, which again add to the fact that Kalinga was a major maritime shipbuilding area. Now we come to the second dynasty which had a major impact in Southeast Asia, that is the Cholas. And the Chola, as we are aware, was a Tamil Empire in South India and one of the largest, longest ruling dynasties in world history actually. And they are mentioned as early as in the times of Ashoka, and they are mentioned in some of his edicts as being the southern neighbors of the Ashoka Empire, though they were never under him, but they were on friendly terms and they are southern neighbors. So they are from around about 250 BC, their mention is found in the Ashokan edicts. And the Chola country and its towns, ports and other trade details also find mention in the books of Ptolemy and other geographers in the Europe. Now there is a very famous history of Ceylon, erstwhile Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, by the name of Mahavamsa, Great Chronicle, which is a very meticulous historical record of Ceylon right from the beginning. Now that also mentions various conflicts between the Cholas and the Ceylon kings from ancient times, and it also mentioned that a Chola prince by the name of Ilalan invaded and conquered Ceylon around 235 BCE with the help of a Mysore army. So records of the Cholas maritime expeditions are recorded from that ancient period. Now one of the first major Chola king who actually became famous was Rajendra Chola I. And his first major expedition was to the Ganges river within the subcontinent, where he conquered the mighty Pala ruler of Patliputra. And thereafter their empire grew greatly. And he was followed by Rajaraja Chola I and other successors who invaded various countries like Sri Lanka, at that time Ceylon, the Maldives, parts of Southeast Asia like Malaysia, Indonesia, southern Thailand, which were under the Srivijaya Empire. Now, in 1025, Rajendra Chola also launched his naval expeditions to the Sri Vijaya and Burmese kingdom of Pegu, and the inscriptions record that he sort of captured or plundered about 14 towns during his expeditions. So one can see that right from ancient times, the Cholas were a major maritime power, and they led numerous expeditions in this region. The result was that the Tamil traders entered the Srivijayan realm and controlled, which was earlier controlled by the local Malayan traders, and that's how the influence of the Tamil traders also expanded in that region. Now we'll come to the Hindu civilizations of Southeast Asia. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be covering 12 countries of East and Southeast Asia where Hindu civilization or influences permeated in the ancient times. Now, the first empire in the Southeast Asia region which was influenced by India was the Funan Empire. Now, this basically, Funan is in present day Cambodia, in that area, which is basically the Mekong Delta. So, it existed along the Mekong River Valley and up to the Mekong Delta in the South China Sea. Not much details are known about this ancient kingdom, but it was a powerful kingdom because excavations have found many Roman, Chinese, Indian and other artifacts. So it shows that they had such vast network of trade and other contacts with these regions, right up to Europe. Now, there is an interesting story how this kingdom was originated. There is an account which mentions that in the 1st century CE, a Brahmin by the name of Kaundinya, he arrived in the coast of Indochina, and he found that the state was being ruled by a Naga king. Naga in our context also refers to royalty, not only snakes. So, I mean, one has to be able to decipher it may not be actually a snake but royalty. And he married the local, the princess, whose name is, it means willow leaf. So, that is basically he was one of the founders of from where the Funan kingdom dynasty sort of grew. Now, archaeology has really, revealed traces of an elaborate system of canals, which was a great technical marvel in those ancient times, and it was designed to control the Mekong River floods. Mekong is one of the big rivers, so that system was so well designed that it could control its floods. It provided irrigation to a vast area where paddy grew, which was one of the main sources of the prosperity of kingdoms in those times. And not only that, it could also control the seawater incursion into the sea when the flow of the river reduced. So it was such an efficient system, and this basically was an import from India, because India, as you are aware, even in those times, flood water control and canal systems were well developed in ancient India in those times in South India. So this is one of the ways one can come to the fact that there were linkages from that period. Now, even the cities of Funan were designed on the Indian model. They had moat fortifications with water around the cities. The houses and warehouses were all richly painted and carved. So, they followed the pattern of the ancient Indian cities which existed in India. The Funan was, as I said, one of the earliest kingdoms in Southeast Asia, having strong Indian influence, and to which the subsequent Khmers who came to power, they traced their heritage. And by the 6th century, the empire grew so big that it extended to more or less the southern part of Burma and right up to the South China Sea, Mekong Delta, that area. So it was a huge landmass which they covered. And there are Sanskrit inscriptions which have been found from that period in that region, and which also mention as early as the 3rd century CE about India and various descriptions about India. And they also mention one of Kaundinyas, the so-called founder of the dynasty of the empire. They even sent an emissary to India in his time. So that is all found recorded in these inscriptions. One of the last great kings of Funan, his name was Rudravarman, naturally a typically Indian name, who ruled around the 6th century CE, and he was a devoted Vaishnavite. And it was in his time a large number of Vaishnavite sculptures and structures were erected. However, after his period, by about mid-6th century, the kingdom was sort of conquered by a vassal state by the name of Chenla. And then Chenla emerged as again an Indianized state. And their first king, of course, was the grandson of the last king of the Funan Empire, and he ascended the throne in about 550 CE. Now, when the Khmers conquered Funan subsequently, after even the Chenla, after Funan came the Chenla dynasty, and then came the Khmers. They named their kingdom Kambuja, and as we are aware, Kambuja is name of one of the ancient kingdoms from the Mahabharata times which existed in present day Afghanistan. So that shows the linkages which are there from the ancient times, which continued its legacy in the Southeast Asian region. Now, after we covered two dynasties, the Funan and the Chenla, the same region, as I mentioned, was taken over by the Khmers in the same Cambodian, that Mekong Delta area. Now, this empire reigned from roughly 9th to 15th centuries CE. And it was one of the major Hindu empires of Southeast Asia. However, during the later stage of their period, they converted to Buddhism. Now, this kingdom lasted, one of the present area, it covers present day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam, the Khmer Empire. And at its peak, the Khmer Empire, the physical size was larger than the Byzantine Empire, the East Roman Empire, which existed around the same time in Europe. So one can visualize the size of the Khmer Empire. And there is a very famous inscription, Sodok Kak Thom, the name of the inscription. This actually is a primary document for detailing and documenting the antiquity of the social and cultural spheres of Cambodia, mentioning the kings and other things. So one of the striking features mentioned there is they followed the matriarchal system in the dynasties, which again was based on Manu Smriti and was widely practiced in southern India that time. So again, it shows the close linkages they had with the Indian subcontinent. In the Khmers, there's a very interesting incident which happened. The Javanese empire at that time was a very powerful empire, and they actually conquered the Khmer empire in Cambodia, and they brought one of the young princes back with them to Java to sort of educate him and tutor him, with the aim that they will send him back and he will rule this area as a vassal of the Java dynasties. Now, when he went back, he the plan failed because he declared his independence and founded his own empire, which the Khmer Empire, and became the first king. And that's how the Khmer dynasty started. However, during his stay, when he was being sort of educated in Java, he kept track of how they were ruling their country. Java also was a Indianized state, and from there he saw that they used this cult of Devraj cult, that is the cult of God King. That means the kings were supposedly blessed by their gods and they protected the empire. So it gave them more moral and authority over the subjects, and helped in building a stronger empire. So he brought this Devraj system back with him to Cambodia when he returned, and he was the first sort of Devraj who got coronated in Cambodia. And there is since Indians believe in that Mount Meru concept of having a link to the gods from earthly to the spiritual level, he constructed a big temple at one of the mountains there, known as Linga Parvat, and declared himself, got consecrated and declared himself as the God King. And the foundation which he laid was so strong that from that period, which was roughly 790 CE, the dynasty ruled till 1350 CE. So it was a long ruling dynasty. The Khmers, as we know, were great builders, and Angkor Wat is one of their biggest creations, which exists even today as the largest temple complex in the world. The Angkor Wat actually covers an area of about 200 hectares. It is that huge, built by King Suryavarman II, who ruled from 1113 to 1150 CE, and took about 37 years to construct. This majestic monument bears testimony to the Khmer Empire's immense power and wealth, impressive art and culture, architectural techniques, aesthetic achievements, and belief systems. Now, another interesting fact is, which shows the power and the wealth of the Khmer Empire, is that during that period, it was the largest pre-industrial urban center in the world in terms of size, and it covered approximately 1,000 Angkor. Angkor was the capital. It covered an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers. That was, one can visualize how huge they had their capital, which showed their wealth and other things. And not only that, they were also great administrators, and they are reputed to have started the world's first healthcare system. And for this, they built about 102 hospitals which have been documented all across the kingdom for this healthcare system to function for the common man. It was during this period that the Chola invasions in Southeast Asia took place, and how it came about was the Khmer king Suryavarman I requested aid from the Chola king Rajendra Chola I, because he was being harassed by the Tambrilinga kingdom in the Malaya Peninsula, and that is how the Cholas came to Southeast Asia with a naval fleet, and the fight with the Srivijaya Empire, who were fighting on behalf of the Tambrilinga Empire. That fight took place and led to the defeat of the Srivijaya Empire and the victory for the Cholas and the Khmers, and one of the first external battles outside the Indian subcontinent. The Khmer, despite being such a huge and wealthy empire, their decline started, and they were finally the dynasty finished with the siege of Angkor, their capital, by the Siamese kingdom in 1413. And one of the reasons which is quoted why they lost, the decline in their power happened and they lost to the Siamese, was because of the advent of Buddhism in the country. So once the kings became Buddhist, the concept of the Devraj was finished, because the Buddhists didn't believe in that concept. And with the loss of the Devraj concept, it led to a loss in the royal authority, and resulting in a dwindling workforce. And because of this, the overall structure of water management, the agriculture and other things slowly reduced and dwindled, leading to loss of prosperity, and finally the empire itself grew smaller and were conquered by the Siamese. So that showed that how that Devraj concept had built strong empires, and after it was removed, the empires actually suffered in terms of their prosperity and power. Now the next South Asian country dynasty we come to is the Champa dynasty. Now Champa is basically the region of present day Vietnam, the coastal strip along the South China Sea, and it existed from roughly the 2nd century CE till as late as 1832, when it was annexed by the North Vietnamese. There was another small empire by the name of, so they annexed it. So they lasted for a very long period of time. The kingdom was known after the word Champa, which we are aware is the name of a flower in India, a fragrant flower. So this is the origin of the name of the Champa empire. And Champa was also the capital of one of the ancient Indian kingdoms by the name of Anga kingdom in near Bhagalpur in Bihar, in present day Bihar, and that shows the linkages from this kingdom and the Indian subcontinent. The Cham script, the Champa, their script was known as the Cham script, is also a descendant of the South Indian Brahmic Granth script. So the language and the script also again came from India for this empire, and a large number of Hindu stone temples have inscriptions both in Cham language as well as in Sanskrit. Champa was again a formidable Hindu kingdom known for its wealth and sophisticated culture. So they were one of those highly cultured dynasties, And the first ruler of the Cham was known by the name of Sri Maran, and he was a Tamil ruler. And it is in the Chinese records he is known by a different name, Q Lian, which translates into Tamil as Thiru Maran. So, and there is a very ancient inscription found in Champa known as the Wo Kan inscription, and it is supposed to be the oldest Sanskrit inscription discovered in Southeast Asia, which mentions the name of Sri Maran, and it has been dated to about 230 CE. Then there are other inscriptions dated later which mention the names of various kings of Champa, and they also trace the ancestry back to the Khmers of Cambodia. Now, their major port of the Champa Empire was named Katigara, which about over 2000 years ago, Ptolemy wrote about Katigara in his book. So it was well known across the world even at that time. And this is the place which is the forerunner of Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City in present day Vietnam. Now the interesting thing is that the Mekong River itself, the name is derived from the word Mai Nam Kong, and which actually means Mother Water Ganga. So the Mekong River also based on the name of river Ganga over time. So one can see the close linkages which existed. Now Hinduism was adopted through conflicts and conquests of territory of neighboring Fuan and shaped the art and culture of the Cham kingdom. And this led to the creation of, there is a place by the name of Mai Son, which is a complex, a cluster of Hindu temples which were built during the Champa dynasty and in present day Vietnam. And for them, during that period of the Champa dynasty, Sanskrit was the official language, and Hinduism, especially Shaivism, became the state religion. Now, Mai Som is a huge cluster of temples. About 70 temples have been exist even today in that complex cluster, and they are supposed to have been constructed between the period of the 4th and 14th century CEs. So one can see how powerful the Hindu influence was during that period. Of course, now there are hardly any traces left except for the ruins of those temples which still exists, and they form the religious hub of the Champa dynasty in its heydays. One of the kings of the Champa Empire by the name of Ganga Raja, who ruled around from 413 CE, he is recorded as one of the only rulers from Southeast Asia who actually physically traveled back to India to to visit the place. It is around the 17th century that the royalty started converting to Islam in Champa, and that's how then the influence of the Hindus and the Buddhists reduced. Another interesting fact about Champa is that there is a group of ethnic Indians who still exist today, and they are known by the name of Bakam or Balmon, and they still follow the Hindu faith, and they are the only one of the two surviving non-Indic indigenous Hindu people in the world. The other one is in Bali. So they are the only two places where people still follow the Hindu faith, a small community, and it exists even till today. There is another interesting recent news event from Vietnam. At one of their heritage national festivals, which was held in 2013, they showed a sculpture of Vishnu, which is supposed to have been dated to about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, from that period. So, in case this is validated, it will be probably the oldest known identifiable Hindu artifact in the world. So, this again is in present day Vietnam, erstwhile Champa Kingdom. Now we come to the Philippines. Philippines, as we know, is now more or less fully Christian, but there was a time when it had strong Hindu influences, a fact which is not known much, even by the present day Filipinos. They are not aware of much of their historical past. There is a Vatican scholar by the name of Father Jose Maria Luengo, who wrote a book, A History of Philippines, a focus on the Christianization of Bohol from 1521 to 1991. Now, he has stated in his book that Philippines were ruled by Hindu kings from 638 CE to 1565 CE. And there was a brief period of Buddhist rule from 1389 to 1424 CE. And hence it is not surprising to find many common features between Indian and Filipino culture. So, it has been documented even by the Vatican that the Hindu kings ruled over Philippines for a long period. Now, the ancient Filipino alphabet itself originated from India and is an offshoot of the Vatilitu alphabet, which is officially classified as a member of the Southern Brahmic language family. And the chiefs of many of the Philippine islands were known as Rajas. And even even now the Filipino, like King Raja Siol of Bhutan, one of the islands in Philippines, he was killed by when the crew of Magellan, when they landed there. So the title of Raja continued till the time the Spanish arrived in Philippines. And even now their teachers are called Guro, Guro, and the traditional martial art of Philippines is called Kali. So there are a lot of common Sanskritized words even in use in present day Philippines. There is a very famous copper plate inscription which was discovered by the name of Laguana copper plate inscription, and it was discovered quite recently, and it is being dated to 900 CE, and it is written in the form of Kavi in Sanskrit and Javanese language. And so a lot of the unknown history of ancient history of Philippines has now been sort of modified after the discovery of this copper plate inscription. And there was a rebel branch of the Chola dynasty which continued to survive in Philippines till the 16th century. That is till the arrival of the Spanish from Mexico. So the kingdom flourished in the Philippines, and they had a very common mixture between, as I said, the Spanish and the local languages. Like even the gods, they called it Dvetas, which is a derivation from the word Devtas. And it was only in 1565 when the Spanish reached there, they sort of took control. But the Filipinos have not lost their ancestry to an extent, and the official flag of the state of Bohol, it still has, it denotes a certain linkages to the Chola dynasty and has kept their memories alive even officially. So that continues to show that the Cholas' influence over Philippines, ancient time, mostly now forgotten, but it is still maintained in the official records of Philippines. The next country is Laos. Now, Laos again was a ancient Indian sort of Indianized country from the 1st century CE. When traders, Indian traders introduced Hinduism in that region, and it was a part of the Khmer Empire, which we have already covered. So the physical boundaries of the countries of Southeast Asia were actually not, in the ancient times, the Khmers, the other empires do not follow the physical boundaries of the countries as we know them today, because they overlapped over neighboring number of countries. But this the Laos was under the Khmer Empire in its time. Naturally, because it was under the Khmer, so they had Angkor Wat. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire, and they also had very mighty religious centers in present-day Laos, which exist in present-day Laos, which are part of the Khmers at that time. One of them is the Wat Pho temple, which still exists in dilapidated form presently, and it is constructed on a hilltop, as most temples are, and it was built with a Shiv ling in the temple at that hilltop. Now, there is a big temple complex around that place, which has all the how the temple complexes were being the approach, and the structures and other things leading up to it. And that I had mentioned that Ling Parvat earlier of the Khmer. So the Ling Parvat, though part of the Khmer Empire, physically exists in present-day Laos, and it is visible there as one of the major religious centers of that empire. Now, there is even a Chinese document from the Sui dynasty, which ruled from 589 to 616 CE, that mentions this temple on the summit of this mountain, which has been translated by George Kodos, the epigraphist, to mean Ling Parvat. So this Ling Parvat even finds mention in Chinese documents of that era. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and what UNESCO website says on this particular place, the Ling Parvat, I quote, "It was shaped to express the Hindu vision of the relationship between nature and humanity, using an axis from mountain top to river bank to lay out a geometric pattern of temples, shrines, and waterworks extending over 10 kilometers. So that was the expanse of this religious complex. And there was a huge, as I mentioned, Shiv ling at the top. However, once the Buddhists took over this area, they replaced the Shiv ling with the Buddha statue on the top of the mountain in the temple. There is another very famous temple which still exists by the name of Wat Zing Thong in present day Laos. which was built in the 16th century by a Buddhist king. However, though it is a Buddhist temple, but it has beautiful golden scenes, painted golden scenes from the Ramayana, which are even visible today. So even though Buddhism came in, the Hinduism never lost its influence. Laos, as we can see, is another forgotten chapter in the history of Hindu Southeast Asia, because hardly much is known in present day context. And like the Philippines, the Laos also had their own version of the Ramayana, which is called the Phra Lak Phra Ram, which comes from the Lao names of Lakshman and Ram. So they have their own version of the Ramayana, which is still enacted in the country today. And one of the most famous books from which most of their Lao stories are derived is the Panchtantra. So Panchtantra is also a very famous source of their present day stories even today. The next country we will touch is Indonesia. Now Indonesia, as we are all aware, has a lot of Indian influence even today, despite being a Muslim country. But at one time it was a major center of Hindu culture and civilization. And when the Islamics took over, only the people which were there in Bali, they with foresight managed to create a ecosystem where they built temples in every village to try and forestall losing their religion and culture. And because of that foresight, they managed to still continue worshipping and following the Hindu culture even today, for which Bali is well known. However, the rest of the country was taken over by the Muslim culture. So they also have their own epics based on the Ramayana and Mahabharata, known as the Wayang Kulit and Wayang Orang, and they continue to be enacted regularly within the country. And Bali, as we know, is a Hindu world of its own in that region, which has survived amongst all the Southeast Asian countries. Early Hinduism in Java, Bali and Sumatra consisted of actually both the schools of Hinduism, that is Shaivites and Vaishnavites. And Java legends can be traced back to as early as 78 CE. So the Hinduism exists from roughly as early as that period. And the stories of the Mahabharata have been traced in Indonesia from about the 1st century CE. And they are similar to the stories in the Southeast Indian subcontinent, that is present day Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. So that shows the linkage of this area in India to Java. The records of the famous Chinese traveler Fa Hin, when he returned from Ceylon to China in 414 CE, he mentions in his travel records also that two schools of Hinduism exist in Java. And as early as 8th century CE, there are references of other Chinese documents which mention the Hindu kingdom of King Sanjaya as Holing, calling it extremely wealthy and peaceful place. And there have been other kingdom. Actually, in Indonesia, there have been many Hindu kingdoms. So, Java, Sumatra, Bali, they all had separate Hindu kingdoms at various points of time. And so, there was a kingdom of Kutai in East Kalimantan. Then you had the Turumangara in West Java, the Holing, or Holing also known as Kalinga, which was in Central Java, the kingdom. So there were many Hindu states in Indonesia, because Indonesia, it's actually a large country spread across numerous islands. One of these kingdoms was a very famous kingdom, and big kingdom was known as Mataram. So this Mataram dynasty, it was during their rule that famous Pramban temple, the second largest temple complex in Southeast Asia, was constructed during in this period of Mataram rule. And various Shastras and Sutras of Hinduism were translated into Javanese language and expressed in their art form during this dynasty's period of rule. Now, by the 7th century, then Sumatra came to be ruled by the powerful kingdom of Srivijaya, which you have mentioned, which had the fight with Cholas at one point of time. So the Indian traditions actually were attractive to the local people because they offered a formalized script, administrative system, and they also offered other systems of law, politics, metaphysics, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and all these things. So they were easily absorbed without any resistance by the locals because they prospered due to that. The earliest major cultural adaptation in Indonesia took place around the 7th century when the Pallava script from southeastern India was adopted for Javanese inscription. So most of their inscriptions in Java were in that script. Because at that time many merchants from South India and even from Gujarat were active in that region. The ancestral language of the Javanese is known as Kavi, and it is actually heavily punctuated by Sanskrit words and phrases, and that's why the names of Indonesian people even today have Sanskrit based names, even though they may be of Muslim faith. So like the king's first name may be Indonesian, but his second name, which is considered sacred, will always be an Indian name, even in the present day context. And one of the key concepts that came to Java and Sumatra from India pertained to the Devraj cult, which I mentioned earlier. So they again followed this Devraj cult where the king was blessed, consecrated and blessed by the gods and protected accordingly, which gave him more moral authority, and he was revered as such by his people. Now, a bit about that Pramban temple which is there. Most of us may have heard of it. It was constructed in the 9th century CE, and it is dedicated to the Trimurti, that means Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, to all three, and the largest temple in Indonesia. And it is a very towering temple, and the largest tower is a 47 meter, that is about 154 feet high spire in the central building, and it has a large complex of subsidiary temples around it, which number 240. So there are 240 temples around the main temple in this complex, and it actually represents the grandeur of ancient Java's Hindu art, architecture, and is a masterpiece of the classical period of Indonesia. Now, even though when Buddhism influence took over in this region, the influence of Hinduism never went away. And even after Buddhist priests came, Buddhists were not allowed to perform certain ceremony like the consecration of the king or confer the status of Chakravartin. These roles were still performed by Hindu priests even when the king became Buddhist. So that amalgamation of both the religions continued in many of these countries in this region even after the Buddhist thought and influence took over in these regions. Another major empire, one was I mentioned the Mataram. The next major Indonesian empire was the Majapahit Empire, which was again a big major Hindu empire in present day Indonesia, and it was considered one of the greatest empires in Indonesian history. Now, Indonesia again was a big maritime power in its ancient times, and which is testified by the Shailendra dynasty and the others, Srivijaya dynasty. They had big navies, and that is how they controlled the maritime sea route which went through the Malacca Straits and the Bangka Straits to southeast from Southeast Asia to China and the islands above. And there is a description, a 14th century description of an Indian ship in Indonesia which has recorded that ships carrying 700 people used to ply. So that shows, it also reflects the state of the Indian maritime power, in which ships as big as being able to carry 700 passengers were plying from India to this region. And the seamen and the navigation and the other things which accompany such large vessels. There is also a record of a naval battle which took place in the 10th century, in which a naval fleet of the Indonesian dynasties sailed across the Indian Ocean and attacked the east coast of Africa to protect their trade interests which were being taken over by the Muslims. So there is a recorded document dated to 955 CE, which gives the description of this fleet consisting of 1,000 ships, it mentions, which went from Indonesia to the eastern coast of Africa to wage a battle there to protect the trade interests of the Indonesian traders in the dynasty. So that is the sort of maritime power which existed, even if we consider this a bit exaggerated, but still that sort of maritime expertise was there to sail across the whole Indian Ocean from Indonesia to Africa. Now we come to Burma, the Indian influences in Burma. Now the Indian cultural influences had naturally the greatest effect on Burma, being closest to our country, and they reached there both by land and sea because both were easily accessible. Buddhism also arrived in Burma in the 1st century CE, by the 1st century CE. Now, Burma itself, because of its geographic location and because of the monsoons which ply over the Bay of Bengal, played an important role in this region of Southeast Asia. And right from 7th, 8th, 9th century inscriptions of Burma which are there, one can see the names of the kings had Indian names. Some of them were connected to the Pallava kings of South India, and these records are still available, showing a large Hindu influence right across the centuries, the initial centuries of after the Common Era. Now, as per the Burmese chronicles, the first Burmese kingdom was established at a place known as Taung in northern Burma, and it was founded by an Indian king who had lost his kingdom in India. That means he was probably defeated, and he went across in search of his fortune and moved there and established his kingdom, established his place in this place by the name of Taung, and set up the kingdom dynasty grew. Now, there was a German archaeologist who studied these ruins in Tagung, and in 1894, this German archaeologist, he found a stone slab which was dated to 416 CE, which had a Sanskrit inscription of that area, and where it is mentioned that the prince who moved into this and formed the dynasty there came from Delhi. So that is the linkage, which being the first person who set up the kingdom in Burma. Thereafter, we had another big dynasty, was the Paiyu dynasty. Its capital was a place known as Sri Kshetra, and now Sri Kshetra, the name was derived from the holy city of Puri, because Puri is also known as Sri Kshetra. So the capital of one of the major dynasties of Burma was named after Puri in Orissa, Kalinga, that in those days, which had a great influence in the region in those days. Now, basically in Burma, Shiva cult, the Shaivites were not having much influence, and mainly the Vaishnavites had influence in lower Burma. And one of the early cities of the Paiyu dynasty was known as Vishnupura, later on named as Bekthano. So even the city was named after Vishnu. And there is a cave site by the name of Kagyun cave site, where a lot of Hindu deities and others have been found, and reliefs of Vishnu, Garuda and all have been discovered in Burma. Now, once the Theravada Buddhism took over in Burma, again, as happened in other countries, the few rituals like coronation and death and other things were still performed as per the Hindu philosophy and not by the Buddhists, even when they had converted to Buddhism. And as late as in the 13th century, the Burmese incorporated the name of Manu, the lawgiver, as one of the basis of their internal philosophy, to give sort of credence and authority to what they were, how they were following the administrative systems. So the Hindu influence did continue till a very late date, even after the Buddhists and Buddhism took over. And it is also interesting to note that the Paiyu kings, they appointed Brahmins from India as their astrologers, even though they were Buddhists. This was to basically enhance their prestige and authority, and to assist them in rituals like coronation and personal purification ceremonies. So the Hindu priests continued uh, in high positions. Bagan is a famous place in Burma, which you are aware, a lot of Buddhist temples and stupas exist in that area. The original name of Bagan was Arimandanpura, which was the kingdom founded by a king by the name of Anarratha. And now this name is derived from the Sanskrit name of Anirudh, and he came to power in 1044. So that again shows the Hinduism's influence in Burma in those days. Now, Anarvatha actually married a princess from Vaishali in India, and though he later on converted to Buddhism, but and he was actually the first king to consolidate the smaller tribes into his kingdom and made it. He is supposed to be the founder of the first united Burmese kingdom, which was earlier scattered into small tribes and local rulers. Now, there is an interesting story about Anarvatha, king who was the first sort of king of united Burma, that he found that the Mon culture, that was basically derived from the Indian culture and traditions and language and everything, was better than the local Burmese culture and civilization they were following. So even though he defeated that area, he he incorporated their culture into his as the official culture. So it's probably one of the only instances in the world where the conqueror adopted the culture of the conquered for his own benefit. So it gives an interesting insight to how they perceived the Indian systems and philosophy, belief, culture, everything. Now, the next country we'll touch upon is Thailand. Thailand, again, as we know, has a lot of Hindu influences, though it's a Buddhist country, fully Buddhist country. And it again, the Hindu influences crept into the region which is now Thailand as early as the 1st century CE. So that is the early Common Era period, was the time where Hinduism actually went across to many of these countries. Of course, as we have seen in some places, it was much earlier though. Now, the southern Siam or the southern peninsula were being open to immigration because of the sea routes and other things. It was directly also affected by India as early as I mentioned 1st century CE, and there was later influence of the Pallava cultures, Pallava dynasty from southern India, and it led to the rise of the Srivijaya Empire in the 6th and 7th century CE, which we have seen, which was based in present day Indonesia. And then a lot of influence also came to Thailand, which was earlier known as Siam, from Kalinga, which we have seen was also a major dynasty in those times. Now, in Thailand, there are basically two main Hindu centers. In the north is Chiang Mai, and in the south is Ayodhya, which is derived from the name of Ayodhya in India. Now, the Hindu, again as I mentioned, and in other countries too, a lot of Thai names are Sanskrit based even today, and their language is actually a mixture of the Khmer, Pali and Sanskrit languages. So what the present Thai language is, it is a amalgamation of these languages where Sanskrit continues to play sort of influence it. And many of the monarchs had their titles as Rajas for a long period of time. And the honorary terms of Shri and Maha, both being Sanskrit names, continue even today in Thailand as common. Now the Thai script is again based on the South Indian Grantha script. So the script again comes from basically India. They have their own version of the Ramayana known as Ramakeen, which is again a very popular art form and regularly performed all over and well known in Thailand even today. And even the name of Phuket, a popular tourist destination, is derived from the Tamil word which means actually crystal mountain. And in Thailand, Phu means mountain and Ket means jewel mountain, and it relates to an original Thai word. Now, one of the main Hindu temples which survives till today is known by the name of Devsthan, which was established in 1784 by King Rama I and remains the center for Hindus in Thailand. And the temple is still run by the Brahmins of the royal court. They are Hindu Brahmins even in the royal court today, and they are the ones who look after this temple. And many Indian deities, Hindu deities, are worshipped in Thailand even today. A famous one is like Brahma. There's a famous temple by the name of Eravan Shrine where Brahma is worshipped even today. And Brahmins, though Brahmins follow Buddhism and wear the shigons, but they also wear the thread even today in Thailand. So that amalgamation which we have seen in other countries even is followed, has happened in Thailand. Now in the royal ceremonies which take place like weddings and coronations, the rituals followed even today are the ancient Hindu rituals, even though they are Buddhists. And to give an example, like when a king was coronated in India, it was called as Raja Abhishek. The Thais call it as Raj Suya, and it comes from one of the Satapatha Brahmanas. The procedure is followed even today from those scriptures. The Thais, though, as I mentioned, they may be our Theravada school of Buddhism, present day followers in Thailand, but their old practices of animistic and Brahminic philosophy and thought continues to sort of influence their present day lifestyle, and it affects even their day-to-day lives in a large number of ways. The Malaya Peninsula, now we come to the next region, which is the Malaya Peninsula. Now we have already talked much about the Malaya Peninsula earlier. Here the Indian influence came as early as about 40 CE, and this is corroborated by inscriptions found on the east coast of Borneo in the region of Kutai in East Kalimantan, the state there, East Kalimantan. So there the inscriptions have been found where the rulers were named, the Indianized rulers were named by titles such as Varman, and they record Brahminic sacrifices and other things in these inscriptions. Now in Borneo, there's an inscription of King Mula Varman who describes various sacrifices, Hindu sacrifices, Vedic sacrifices which are there, like donating gold or cows to Brahmins and others, which have been described in detail, showing their Hindu influence. And there have been, the Puranic religion has been, was followed there, which is visible in the form of images which have been found, like image of Vishnu has been found, then those of Shiva, Ganesh, Nandi, Agastya, Nandi, Brahma, Skand, Mahakal, they have all been found in a place known as Kombeng. So these all lead to adding to the fact that there was strong Hindu influence in old Malaya Peninsula. Then in Brunei, this in 6th century, it came under Hindu influence. Brunei, is a separate country now. And this owed allegiance to the Majapahit Empire of Java, which was the ruling empire in that region. And the Sultanate even today is known by its original Sanskrit name of Bandar Seri Bhagwan. So Brunei again had strong Hindu influence, even though now it is a staunch Islamic country. In Malacca, now as late as the 14th century, there was a Malaya prince who was a Hindu by the name of Parmeshwara, who was a vassal state of the Majapahit Empire of Indonesia. So that is recorded there. This Parmeshwara, he maintained close relations with China and even visited the country there. So Malacca again had strong Hindu influences, and these are supported by many inscriptions and archaeological finds. And these inscriptions which you are talking about are basically written in Sanskrit and the Indian alphabet, which was used in the 4th, 5th century era in India. So it is should be from that period. And many of the statues which have been found, they reflect the sculpture style art of the Gupta period. They have been found in Kedah and Perak, which are again regions in present day Malaysia. Now on the mainland Penang, there's a 4th century rock fragment has been found with Sanskrit inscriptions, and there it is written in the old Pallava alphabet. Now anyone who has been to Kuala Lumpur will know that one of the most wealthy suburbs of Kuala Lumpur is known as Jaipura even today, which again is obviously a Hindu name. And though Malaysia is now a staunchly Islamic country, but a large number of functioning temples still exist in Malaysia because of the large Indian origin population there. And there's a huge list of which can be accessed online. So a very active Hindu community still exists in Malaysia even today. And one of the most popular shrines outside of India, most visited shrines, is in Malaysia at the place named as Batu Caves, which is near to Penang. These Batu caves are limestone caves dating about 400 million years old, and the temples there are dedicated to Murugan, or the god of war, and there is an iconic 43-meter high statue of Lord Murugan at the entrance, and you have to climb a large number of steps to enter the cave. And this is one of the most visited Hindu shrine outside India in the world, though may not be as big as Angkor Wat others, but it's an active Hindu temple. Now we come to a few countries where the origin of Hindu influence is hardly known. The first is China. Now one hardly hears or knows about what Hindu influence was there in ancient China. So archaeological evidence gives a significant presence of Hinduism in different provinces of medieval China, which is surprising to most of us. And this basically again went through the traders, and there were Tamil merchant guilds of Ayyavol and Manigramam, which once thrived in South China, and they are the ones who basically through whom these shrines and other influences reached China. Now there are evidence of Tamil Shiva motifs and temples such as in the Kaiyuan temple, which is in Guangzhou, Fujian, a province in southeast China. Then there are traces, Hinduism's trace in Chinese culture can be found, and on Chinese Buddhism, the influence of Hindu thought is there. And many of the Hindu gods have been sort of adapted into the pantheon of the Chinese Buddhism. So one example is the Chinese Buddhist belief in the 24 Devas, a grouping of protected Dharmapalas of Hinduism. So they have sort of adopted this thinking into their Chinese Buddhism. Now 21 of the Devas out of the 24 consists of deities borrowed from Hinduism. And some of these are like Shiva, Indra, Brahma, Lakshmi, Saraswati and Yama, which have now got Chinese names and incorporated into these 24 Devas of Chinese Buddhism. Now these statues of these 24 Devas are enshrined in many Chinese Buddhist temples and monasteries even today. Now the Hindu influences reached China roughly from about 65 CE. So as early as 65 CE, and basically this was through the overland route through Central Asia, not by the sea route. This happened because after the Great Wall of China was completed around 244 BC, and the Chinese emperors decided that the region is safe, so they then opened the trade routes from Central Asia, and that is, once the trade routes were opened, then the missionaries and traders, they brought in the external influences into the country. Now another reason for the spread of Hinduism into China was facilitated by the great Kushan Empire. Now Kushan Empire, which we are aware, they ruled in the area of Kashmir, Afghanistan, that area, and they adopted Buddhism during their period in the 1st century CE. And they the Kushan Empire ruled over a vast empire stretching from Delhi right up to Central Asia. And because of this, they facilitated and sort of established a bridge for the flow of Indian culture and influences along that route into China. Then in the 7th century CE, another route was established through Tibet. And this was because of two marriages. Now, the Tibet was also a very powerful kingdom in those days. It was a very powerful independent kingdom, and the king, he married two princes. One was a Nepali and one was a Chinese, and because of that, another route of ingress of external influences opened from the Indian subcontinent through Tibet into China because of these two marriages to the Nepalese and the Chinese princesses. And later on, these influences also traveled through the sea route via Southeast Asia, Srivijaya, and all these empires, Indianized empires on this route. So that is also how subsequently a lot of Indian influence reached China by sea. Now, evidence of Hinduism in China has been found, as I mentioned, in Fujian province, and there have been found Tamil Chinese bilingual inscriptions dated to 1281 CE, devoted to Shiva, as well as over 300 artifacts, idols, and Chola style temple structures have been discovered in the 20th century during archaeological excavations in this region. So it's quite substantial. And the archaeological studies suggest Vaishnavism and Shaivism schools both were existing in China. And the discovery of the Shivling, the Yoni in Jaichun caves, and other Hindu motifs were found during excavations of the Dali temple in Yunnan. So then in Lopnor and Kizil caves in Xinjiang province, carvings of Ganesha, mural scenes from the Ramayana with Hanuman, and other frescoes of Hindu deities have been found, and these have been dated to roughly between the 4th to the 6th century CE. Now, the spread of Hinduism in this is basically the southern part. Now, spread of Hinduism in the north central China by the 5th century to the provinces as far as Shanxi is evidenced by various caves which have been found in the Yungang grottos of Datong. There is a place by the name of Datong where deities such as Vishnu and Shiva, they have been discovered. And then they have a lot of, as I mentioned, Hindu deities have been incorporated into their pantheon, like the Yakshas, which we have. Then Garuda is known as the golden winged great Peng. Then Hanuman is known as a Chinese mythological character by the name Sun Wukong. Then you have like this many deities which have been incorporated. Then another interesting fact is that with the burning of Nalanda and these great universities in India, we lost a lot of our original manuscripts of ancient scriptures and a lot of writings. Now, before, as we are aware, a lot of foreign students used to come to Nalanda and all to study, and who used to take away manuscripts with them on their return. So many manuscripts, and these manuscripts were then translated into Chinese. Now many of such manuscripts which have been translated into Chinese but have been lost in India because of these Islamic invasions and their destruction caused in their aftermath. Now they have been found in lists of Chinese dynasty writings. And all these, there was a bibliographical catalog made during the time of the Sui dynasty, which ruled from 581 to 618 CE, which had compiled the list of all the a catalog of manuscripts which they had. So all the Indian manuscripts which are translated into Chinese, they were prefixed by a word known as Polo Ming. Now that means of Brahminical origin. So like you have Polo Min Thing Wen Ching, that means Brahminical astronomical manual. So then you have Brahminical mathematics, then you have Brahminical pharmaceuticals. So like this, a number of original manuscripts lost to us are available in that form of the Chinese translations with the word of Brahminical prefix to their names. Then another interesting fact is that during the Tang dynasty, the Chinese were influenced by Indian astronomy and calendars, and there were Indian Brahmins who were experts in this knowledge. They were officially appointed in their Bureau of Astronomy which they had in China, and Indian astronomers, they were advising the Chinese courts also. There is one 7th century document of a Tang dynasty physician by the name of Sun Shu Miao, who states categorically that a successful physician must base his knowledge not only on Confucian or Taoist theory, but also on Indian medical works, for only these would enable one to appreciate the healing powers of love and compassion. The next country where one doesn't expect to find Hinduism is Japan. Hinduism has only a very limited presence in Japan, but it is there. And it has also indirectly played a role in the formation of the present day Japanese culture. This is because many Buddhist beliefs and tradition which share a common root spread to Japan from China and the Korean peninsula in the 6th century CE. So basically to Japan it went through China and Korea. There is a Sangjen-do temple, a big temple in Japan built in 1164 CE, which is a Buddhist temple in Kyoto and is guarded by around 1,000 armed human-sized statues of Kannon, the Japanese goddess of compassion. Now, these 1,000 life-size Kannon wooden statues have 28 guardian deities in front of them present, even today, and these guardian deities are all of Indian origin and primarily Hindu gods. In ancient Japanese Buddhism, Hindu deities were revered and given a place of respect in the Buddhist pantheon. And the beautiful harmony with which the ancient Japanese monks managed to fit all gods and deities from the parent stream of Hinduism into its offshoot Buddhism is quite remarkable, and probably the only place where such a thing has happened. An indication of this is the Japanese 7 gods of fortune, which they revere. Out of these 7, 4 are Hindu deities, which are Saraswati, Kuber, Shiva and Lakshmi with their Japanese names. So that is how they have managed to actually amalgamate beautifully the Hindu gods into their Buddhist thought. Then a few other gods like the Hindu god of death or Yama is known in Buddhist form as Enma. Then Garud is known as Karura, which is depicted as an enormous fire-breathing creature. Then you have tenins, which are originated from the Apsaras of the Hindu religion. Then you have Ganesh, also known as Kangiten. He is displayed in some temples even more number of times than Buddha himself, in few of the temples, in one of them being in Tokyo. So there are other examples also. These are the deities, but even the philosophy, like the Japanese have their 6 schools or 6 doctrines of philosophy, which basically is taken from the Indian, the 6 darshanas or the schools of philosophy which we have in our Hindu scriptures. So there's been a lot of influence into not only the religious thought but also the philosophy of Japanese Buddhism. Then we come to Korea. Now, Korea again is a country which no one relates with Hinduism in any form, but there were strong linkages in the past, again which can be traced back to roughly the 1st century CE. Now, there is an interesting story of, there was a princess, Indian princess by the name of Suri Ratna. She was a descendant of the Ishkwaku dynasty from Ayodhya in India. And she traveled, there's an ancient Korean chronicle by the name of Samguk Yuva, which means actually memorable of the 3 kingdoms. And Princess Suri Ratna traveled from Ayodhya to Korea in 48 CE, and she married the king there, King Suro, and who was the founder of the first kingdom in Korea known as the Karak kingdom. So actually the Karak dynasty started with the queen who was of Indian origin. And in 2001, they have built a memorial in memory of this queen who went from Ayodhya. At Ayodhya, on the banks of Saryu River, a memorial has been built, and a postage stamp was jointly released by the government of India and Korea in commemoration of this event. So this is a fact which is not much known to either the Indians or the Koreans of Indian linkages to Korea. Now, the Hinduism again had indirect impact on certain aspects of Korean thought, like it similarly as in Japan. They have these 4 heavenly kings whom they believe in, and which are present in Korean Buddhist temples. These basically have originated from the Lokpalas which are there depicted in Hindu temples and otherwise. And many Hindu deities like Kartikeya, Shiva or Indra, Yama and Brahma are also worshipped in the local forms in Korea. Emphasis was placed on various Hindu deities which were incorporated into the Mahayana Buddhist, which the Koreans follow, and they are often addressed as the guardian deities. So the Hindu deities are referenced there as the guardian deities, and their Sanskrit and Korean names, like for Indra is known as Josecheon, then Brahma is known as Bomecheon, and Skand or Kartikeya is known as Vitacheon. So they have again adopted these Hindu deities into their own pantheon with their names. And even some of the late presidents and prime ministers of Korea who were elected in the recent past, they also trace their lineage from the original Karak dynasty, which was founded by the queen was from Indian origin. And there are still some temples in Korea which depict the figures of Indra and Brahma and others even today inside the temple complex, which exists. So there has been a reasonable Hindu connection, but this again is a forgotten chapter in Korean and even Indian history. So with that, I concluded the 12 countries where the influence of Hinduism was prevalent in East and Southeast Asia during ancient times. And with that, I come to the conclusion that as we look at the evidence regarding the spread of Hinduism in Southeast Asia, the picture that emerges is one of fluid interaction and widespread growth of advanced and flourishing civilization. At one time, starting from the early period of the Common Era, Hinduism spread rapidly across the whole region and primarily by trade and cultural contact. The influence diffused easily across this region since it brought advanced culture, language, knowledge, traditions and statecraft. So there was no conflict between the locals in accepting this external infusion. And there were, however, few instances where this infusion was militarily through expeditions and battles. Now, the impact of this dynamic past exists even today. For example, the impact and history of Hindu Majapahit Empire, which was one of the big empires in Indonesia, is at the heart of the Indonesian consciousness even today. And this is reflected in many of the national symbols which exist, even though Indonesia is now a Muslim country, but those things still exist in their consciousness and in the national symbols. Like the color of the Indonesian flag is red and white, and it is called Dwivarna, bicolor, which is derived from the Majapahit royal colors of the ancient dynasty, which was a Hindu dynasty. Then similarly, the Indonesian coat of arms has the Garud depicted on it even today. The national airline of Indonesia is known as Garud Airlines. Then another interesting thing is that the Garud holds a very important place in the national culture of Indonesia, and this is evident by the largest statue depicting any Hindu deity in the world is a 122 meter high, which is equivalent to a 21-story building, a statue of Garud holding Vishnu, which is there in Bali, and it is the highest Hindu deity statue in the world as of today. So, and it was completed as recently as 2018, just a few years ago. So that shows that how much influence the Hindu thinking still has in Indonesia. And the other thing is, like, the tallest statue of Ganesha at 49 meters exists not in India but in Thailand. So there are so many instances of these various countries in Southeast Asia having a large impact of Indian thinking of Hinduism in their current thought and their daily lives. However, the future of Hinduism is not very bright in this region because the younger generation basically have got out of touch with their roots and slowly turning away from this. So it remains to be seen how in the future this Indian and Hindu influence continues in this region of Southeast Asia. Now, I will summarize my talk with a quote from a famous author, Amitav Acharya, about how Indianization has impacted these regions. He mentions, I quote, Indianization is different from traditional colonialism because it doesn't involve strangers coming in and taking over an unknown land. Even the rare instances of conquests by Indian kings were not permanent and did not translate into establishing a forceful physical presence. Instead, Indian influence through trade routes and language use slowly permeated through Southeast Asia, making these traditions a part of the local milieu because of their superior philosophy, knowledge, and language it had to offer. Indianization and its influence was seen in nearly all aspects of Southeast Asian society, culture, and history. Unquote.